Children's Church with Megan today. Bye. And with that, just a few announcements. First announcement is thank you to those of you who volunteered yesterday for our trunk or treat. I would say, in my opinion, it was the best one we've done since we started it. Best turnout, best amount of trunk. I think maybe the most amount of trunks there. A lot of fun. A lot of kids came through and had a great time playing games, making crafts, having food and fellowships. So that was great. Thank you for volunteering for that. The next announcement is that we are doing a love offering today, and we can extend it certainly if you are not able to today. Rick Hale and Arnie Maison have done a lot of work on the outside property. Now, neither of them have asked for a dime, so I want to make that clear. But, and if you know Rick, he's probably hating that I'm doing this, but they've put in probably close to 200 hours now at this point of work on digging all around the property, taking out sprinkler systems that did not work, putting in new sprinkler systems, taking out bushes along the property, shrubs along the property, plants that were dying, and a lot of work in the hot sun through the month of August, September. And so we want, as a board, to thank them for the work that they have done. And so if you would like to make an offering, a gift, donation to the both of them, you can. There's envelopes on the back table there. You can put cash in there, or you can put a check in there. And if you just put love offering on the envelope, we'll make sure it gets to them, and then we will be getting a very, very nice gift card for them to thank them for all that they have done for us. A lot of people do a lot around here, but specifically want to thank them for all the work that they've put in throughout the summer and beyond, doing all of that work to get our property ready. And it's not done yet, and so they'll still be doing work. If you'd like to help with that, you can talk to them about that. The last announcement that I have is that Thanksgiving is coming. It feels crazy that it's already here, basically. Thanksgiving and then Christmas in just a couple months. So we are entering the holiday season. One of the things that we do every year is we collaborate with Norwalk High School. For the last 4 or 5 years, they've had a Thanksgiving basket program where they have raised money to make amazing Thanksgiving baskets for families in need in their community. And so these baskets have canned goods. These baskets have a pumpkin pie baked by the culinary program there. They have a $25 to $50 gift card to a grocery store. They used to do turkeys, but what they realized is that a lot of these families don't have kitchens that can cook them turkeys. Some of these families are living in hotels, living in their car, and so they don't really have the ability to cook a big turkey. And so they started providing gift cards to the family. That way they can choose their own side or their own main dish that they can cook up for their Thanksgiving lunch. And so if you would like to donate to that, we will accept gift cards, Stater Brothers, Northgate. You can donate online at the Burn Bay website. You can donate to me, and I'll get that to them if you want to give a cash or check. And so just want to put that out there. And we do plan, speaking of Thanksgiving, we do plan on having our Thanksgiving kind of fellowship that we had last year. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving is a busy season, but we invite people to come and just pause in the busyness of Thanksgiving to be thankful for what God has done in our lives. So every Wednesday before Thanksgiving, we have desserts, and we have a great time of sharing gratitude together. And so that's going to be the Wednesday before Thanksgiving here at church. There will be no men's and women's Bible study that night, but we will have this gratitude sharing night. That's all I have for announcements. Now we have Eric doing sharing time today, and so I'll invite Eric up to do that.
What does Steve always say? It's that time again. And I brought comfortable shoes for doing lots of laps around the church, so if you want to think about it and wait till I get back up here, and I'll try to do my best Steve impersonation. I won't even roll my eyes when you make me walk really far. Okay, so we've been reading through and studying through together Nehemiah with Pastor Michael. And I could dismiss that, can't I? And something that's kind of struck me as we've been going through this a couple of different times, Nehemiah has this interesting response to opposition. It seems like a reflex to him. That's different than my response generally to opposition. Like, for instance, the first time we see him getting a moment of opposition, the people of the land there, who are living in the land or have been moved in by the Babylonians or Assyrians or whatever, there's people who are opposing the work when he says, I think we need to rebuild these walls. I think we need to fix this. And he came out there with a letter from King Artaxerxes, the guy who's in charge of this entire empire, this now Medo-Persian empire. It says, it's okay with you to go out there and rebuild those walls. It's got a letter from the guy in charge, right, saying this. And yet when the people challenge him, what I would have done is I'd have pulled out the letter, see, yeah, no, I do. He told me to do this, right? That's not what Nehemiah did. Do you remember what he said? He said, the God of heaven will give us success. He didn't break out the legal things. He says, look, God is going to bless this. A couple chapters later, his response is prayer. He says, hear us, O God. This is what's going on, and we need you right now. Third time, the end of middle of chapter 6, I guess, he says, I prayed, now strengthen my hand. So what's Nehemiah doing each time he's facing opposition? His first reaction is to turn to God. By the way, our band rehearses at a First Southern Baptist Church in Gardena. It's where Betsy and I got married. One of the head pastors there is a phenomenal trombonist and a beautiful Christian man. They have a sign on the back wall in the hallway there behind the sanctuary that says, before all else fails, pray. It's like, oh yeah. Yeah, why wait? Why wait till things are going really poorly? Like, pray first. This is a common lesson in the Old Testament too. So I'd like you to think about a time when you've faced opposition. Maybe there's something going on right now. Either opposition for doing the right thing, pressure to do the wrong thing. Maybe just for being a Christian. Maybe it's something that's not a person. Maybe there's something else that's challenging your Christianity, your energy, your time, your ability to focus on what you know God wants you doing. That's opposition too, because we're in spiritual warfare, not just, dealing with people who are trying to mess us up and trip us up. I also want to add one more thing. One thing that Nehemiah says is, Lord, don't forgive these people. Well, we're not Nehemiah's time anymore. Jesus has come, and he kind of raised the bar on that. What are we supposed to do now? We're supposed to pray for even those who persecute us for doing the right thing. Pray for the opposition. Maybe even pray for the Toronto Blue Jays sometimes. I don't know. I know that's going to be hard. I can see that that's going to be hard there. Anyway, so think about this. Is there a situation where you're in? And I will share one. Betsy is not here today. She's had a couple of bad days with her back, and she's trying to prepare to go to, she has an appointment, a pre-op appointment with a surgeon tomorrow that she wants to make sure she gets to that appointment. It's not for her back. Surgery on your back is something you only do when there's a very last resort and she's not there and there's nothing really to fix that way anyways. It's a surgery she used to do on people, and so now it's her turn to have it done to her, sort of thing. So anyways, pray for the pain, pray for her to have the courage to get to the appointment and get through it okay, and because right now her opposition is pain, is back pain. It's getting a little bit better, but it's kind of a long drive tomorrow, so. Anyways, we'd appreciate your prayer for that. I'd like you to pray right now, just for a moment, silently. Think about what oppositions you're facing in your life. And then a couple people can share, and then we'll get up and talk to each other. Okay? Isn't it great that we can go straight to him? Is there a face that comes to mind? Or a circumstance? Would anyone like to share with your brothers and sisters here this morning? All right, Tina.
An opposition I'm facing right now is a couple weeks ago I told you that my son and my daughter, my son and, his daughter-in-law, I don't know what to, anyways, they let me bring the baby here. Yesterday I noticed that she was a little bit off, the mom. And so, and the mom, so she told me that she wanted to let the baby go with her sister. So me trying to stay neutral, I said, that's fine. And then I text her, is everything okay? And she called me back, and her and my son are not seeing eye to eye, I guess, and I didn't realize it because my son didn't bring things up, and when they're in front of me, they seem like they're okay. But I told her, because I come here and because I faced a lot of, like you say, oppositions that I prayed for and it's come through, I said, well, you know what? I said, I'm not sure what you're dealing with, but I said, just put it in God's hands and pray, and I will pray for you too. And unfortunately, she told me, I appreciate it, and I know you mean that sincerely, but she says, I don't believe in God. And it hurt. But I said, Mija, you may not believe about him right now for whatever you're going through, but I will pray that he will come into your heart and change the way you feel. I said, because God brought you that beautiful baby, and that's God's work right there. I said so. And she said, thank you, and then just stood quiet. So I've been praying for her very hard since last night, so. But that's what I was facing, and I'm going to just keep putting that little piece of God in her. And, whether she accepts it or not, I know one day maybe she will, and for the good of her daughter, my granddaughter.
What is her name?
Susie. Susie is my Andrew's mom's name.
Okay, praying for Susie's salvation, because everyone will believe him one day. Let's hope it's not the moment she's standing before him. Yeah. Anyone else? Now I know what this is like. I saw Lisa's hand go up. I was going to go, what? Then she went like this. Okay. No? All right.
Well, first of all, good morning. God bless you. I don't have a major opposition right now, really, but I know we all. They're minor, so I'm sure all of us have some level of opposition, and compared to others. I understand that, but just to encourage you, I got encouraged this morning reading this verse that says in Psalms. Thank God for the book of Psalms. They're so encouraging to us as Christians as we're going through difficult times. And in light of what's going on in the world and in our country, it's pretty sad. But in Psalms 31 it says, to be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart, all you who hope in the Lord. So as I read that this morning, God is telling us as Christians, be courageous. Being courageous is when you're going through something hard and tough and you can't handle it. God will strengthen your heart, strengthen our hearts if we remain courageous. And that's all we have to. That's what we have to do, and not give up, and not faint, and not say that there's no God. Why continue living? But in order to have our hearts strengthened by God, so we can get through things, is just courage and faith in Him. That's and that's what we have to do. So whatever you're going through, it is tough. It is tough, but with God telling us to be of courage, and we'll be able to get through.
Amen. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, then I would encourage you to get up and talk to someone you have not talked to in the last 4 weeks. Okay? Try to find somebody new. Something you've... Michael, you can share too. I understand. Pastor's like, there's some opposition built into that too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Has it been 4 weeks since we've chatted? Yeah. So feeling better after last night? The Dodgers wise? Thursday? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, me too. Me too. I'm pray for that. Yeah. I had a hernia repair surgery almost 2 months ago now. And I was talking to another guy who works at the Bellflower Pool, because my wife swims every Saturday morning. And this guy's a teacher at a Catholic school, and he had that same surgery. So we happened to have the same surgeon too, which was kind of strange. And so we were talking back and forth about it. And I mentioned that, on the bill, it was like the surgery, and then there was this excision of something, of a lesion from something. And I said, the doctor never told me about that. So I want to go in and talk to him and find out, was there really a lesion there? If so, did you do a biopsy and was there anything wrong with it? Or is the surgery center just trying to bill me extra, right? So, because he never mentioned it. And the guy says, well, you worried about it? And I said, well, no. If it's something bad and the Lord takes me, it's, I'm not going to change his timing, so why would I worry about that? It's his hand, right? So I know that feeling. It's like, I could worry about that, but why? Why should I? Yeah, I'm not going to change the date. I'm going to go see him at some point. I have a feeling it'll be an improvement from whatever's going on right now. So. Yeah, and believing in him makes all the difference. Yeah. All right, well, thank you. I still have the mic. Do you want to say it? Oh. Okay. All right. I'll press you then. So before I pass it back, can I? Sure. Okay. What you gotta do. All right. All right. Thank the people you're with for sharing. Thank you, Michael, for sharing with me and telling me all those secret things about Ruby. Just kidding. It didn't even work. She's not listening. Somebody will tell her. All right, I just want to say one last thing before I shut up and do what I'm supposed to do. Please continue to pray for Michael and Caitlin on a regular basis. They've done wonderful things for us and for our church. It's also, they are the most vulnerable, or the most, I don't know if they're not vulnerable. They're the ones that would most like to be taken out by the opposition, by Satan and the demons. So they face spiritual warfare, possibly more than many of the rest of us. So keep them in prayer.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. Would you pray with me now for my sermon this morning? Dear God, thank you, Lord. Thank you that you defend us, that you fight for us, that you fight against the enemy for us, God, that you are victorious, as we preached about last week, God. You have victory over the enemy, and you will defeat the enemy, God. You have already defeated the enemy, but you defeat the enemy daily in our lives, Lord. And so I ask that you would continue to work in our lives, continue to overcome the opposition in our lives, Lord. And I ask as I preach now, would you speak through me? Would you fill me with your words, God? I don't want to preach on anything that isn't from you, God. That anything that isn't true to your word and your heart, Lord. And so I ask you, God, would you fill up my words with your words, God? Would you fill up my spirit with your spirit? Would you fill up my mind with your thoughts, God, so that I may communicate only what you have for us this morning, God? That I may be faithful to you and preach true to your word, Lord. Amen. This morning, we're continuing in our book of Nehemiah. We only have a few weeks left in this. We're going to be finishing just in time for Advent. As we've gone through this series, we've recognized that this series is all about the mission that God has given Nehemiah. And yet what we've also recognized is that there's a whole story that was leading up to what happened for Nehemiah. Right? We said that this story began in the book of Genesis when God calls a man named Abraham and tells Abraham, I will make a nation out of you. I will bring a nation. I will bring God's people out of you. And so God begins to work out of Abraham to bring this nation of Israel. And so for the entire Old Testament, Israel is God's special, holy, chosen, set-apart people. And yet, even in the midst of that, we see that Israel is not perfect. That throughout their time, Israel constantly is making choices that are against God in their lives. And one of those times we see that as a consequence, the nation of Babylon comes into Jerusalem and tears down the temple, tears down the place that they had held as important, and takes the Israelites captive for 70 years. And for 70 years they are forced to live in Babylon, and the temple lies destroyed. But after those 70 years, we see that they're allowed to return to Jerusalem. And that's what the book of Ezra is about. We didn't study the book of Ezra, but in the book of Ezra, we see that the temple is rebuilt. This temple, which is a place of primary importance, not only for worship, but for the city life, after 70 years, is rebuilt and is now standing. And so that's where we start the book of Nehemiah. But the book of Nehemiah is all about God using Nehemiah to lead the project to rebuild the city walls around the temple. See, though the temple was standing, at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah, what we see is that the city walls are not up. And so, yes, the temple is there, but without the city walls, opposition can come in. Opposition can come in and try and attack the people. Opposition can come in and try and overthrow them again and take them captive again. But throughout the book of Nehemiah, we see that Nehemiah is consistent in his mission to rebuild the city walls. And last week we saw that he was victorious in this mission. That after just 52 days, the city walls were rebuilt. And so now what's standing, as we enter into chapter 7 this morning, the temple is standing, the city walls are standing around the temple, and everything is in order. Everything is as it should be. And because everything is as it should be, we see that Nehemiah begins in chapter 7, what we're going to read today. Nehemiah begins by rebuilding, or by setting up what he has rebuilt, setting up and doing the maintenance of what he has rebuilt. And so we're going to read from 7:1 to 6 today. It says this: After the wall had been rebuilt, and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, the musicians, and the Levites were appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hananiah, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people do. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their own houses. Now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families. I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first return. This is what I found written there. And although you want me probably to read all of those names in the next 60 verses, for the sake of time, I'm not going to, but you can certainly read it later on your own time. But I want to focus on just these first 6 verses first. And so we see in Nehemiah 7:1 that the initial work had been completed. And as the initial work had been completed, we see Nehemiah begins to appoint people to various positions. And so we see that he's looking at the work that had been completed, and as he's looking at the work and he knows the work's been completed, he says, I know that there are people that I need to begin to appoint. There are roles that I need to begin to fill. And we see that 3 of these positions include gatekeepers, musicians, and Levites. Now, as I look at the positions that Nehemiah is appointing people to, I find it quite interesting, the roles that he does. In these 3 roles, we find 3 different but vital roles to the life of the temple. The first role that we find Nehemiah appointing people to is gatekeepers. And in this, I believe what we see is that Nehemiah knows that there's some safety, right? There's some safety because the city walls have been rebuilt, and so there's less opposition that could come in. But that doesn't mean that opposition can't come in. That doesn't mean that an opposing army can't come and fight. And because Nehemiah knows that they can still come against him, he needs to set up protection around these city walls. And that's what these gatekeepers are going to be. They're going to be people who watch what's going on. And if opposing armies come in, they can defend the temple. They can defend the city. And so this is why Nehemiah appoints gatekeepers. But we also see that because the temple is now there, the temple is now standing, Nehemiah appoints both musicians and Levites. Now for the temple, it's critical that they had musicians who could lead the people in worshiping God. Even at that time when worship looked quite different from how it does today, it was critical that the people of God could worship musically. Because of this, Nehemiah recognizes that one of the most important roles he could appoint was musicians. Musicians would be some of the people that would restore the temple back to a place where people worshiped God. But it's not only musicians, it's also Levites that Nehemiah appoints here. Just like the musicians during this time, the Levites that Nehemiah appoints are critical to the temple life that goes on. During the time of Nehemiah, Levites are tasked with the role of assisting the priest. And so you had the priest who led worship, the priests who were said to be the mediators between man and God. But we also see that these priests played various spiritual functions, including worship, music, teaching, guarding the temple, and maintaining its operations. In this, we see it's extremely important that Nehemiah appoints these Levites because they were going to be the people who made sure that worship went on in the temple, who made sure that the services went on in the temple. And so here we have three important roles. We have the gatekeepers, we have the musicians, and we have the Levites. But as we look at these three important roles, isn't it interesting that these three are the three that we're told Nehemiah appoints here? You see, the reality is that there were many roles that Nehemiah could have started with. One of the things that Nehemiah could have done was start with the spiritual roles and only focus on the spiritual roles. And so Nehemiah could have spent his time just focusing on the service in the temple. But that's not what Nehemiah does here. Nehemiah does not simply appoint the spiritual roles of the temple, but he extends it to appoint the gatekeepers. For Nehemiah, he recognizes that there is great importance in the spiritual life of the temple. But the important roles are not just limited to spiritual roles. Because think about what could have happened if Nehemiah did not appoint gatekeepers. If Nehemiah did not appoint gatekeepers to be around the temple to watch and make sure that no opposing armies came in. Yeah, they could have had worship, and they could have had their worship services, and they could have done spiritual things, but then an opposing army could have just easily come in because they don't have the physical defense around the temple. They didn't have, if they didn't put gatekeepers there, they wouldn't have had the safety that they needed to do the worship of God. And why do I bring this up? I bring this up because how many times in the church do we think that the only important roles in the church are the spiritual roles? How many times in the church do we prioritize the spiritual roles and have a value on those roles more than we think of the physical roles? When we think of the words important roles in the church, we might think of the pastor. We might think of worship leaders. We might think of Bible study teachers. We might think of those who lead prayer meetings. And it is true that those are important roles in the church. But we would be mistaken if we thought they were the only important roles in the church. Because if you have a pastor preaching here but no maintenance team, What happens when something breaks and then the pastor's preaching and maybe the roof goes out and there's no maintenance? Well, then the roof falls on me and I squish. What happens if you have a worship team but you don't have a tech team who can put the slides up or who can do the sound of the music? What happens if you are an evangelist and you invite people to church, but there's nobody with trunks passing out candy at the trunk or treat? They're coming and there's not going to be any event coming and they're going to feel super awkward because now they came to church and there's nothing going on. See, but in Nehemiah's example, I believe what we're invited to see is that there are many different roles that are key to the functioning of the community. There are many different roles that make up the mission of the church. It's not just the spiritual roles, but it's the physical roles that allow the work of God to continue in the church. And that's what we continue to see as Nehemiah continues to delegate leadership to others. As we continue to look at this passage here, we see that in verse 2, it says Nehemiah puts Hananiah and Hananiah in charge of Jerusalem. Now, up until this point, we have seen Nehemiah was the leader. Nehemiah was in charge of the work that was happening in Jerusalem. From the very beginning, when Nehemiah heads back to Jerusalem, Nehemiah has the crowd around him, and he says, do you see what I see? Do you see the broken down walls that I see? We must do something about this. And so from the very beginning, Nehemiah is the one that is overseeing everything. And because of this, Nehemiah has the power to decide what happens in Jerusalem. However, in these two men, we see Nehemiah begin to give away power. As I look at this example here, I see it as an image of what it means for leaders to delegate real responsibility to others. And I find this striking here that Nehemiah gave this much leadership away to these two men. Because it's one thing for Nehemiah to say, hey, I need help building the city walls. Can you grab some tools and let's build the city walls? It's one thing for Nehemiah to ask the people around him to do the work. But it's a whole nother thing for Nehemiah to say, hey, this place that I've been overseeing, this project that means so much to me, here's leadership over it. It's easy for leaders to invite people to work. It's a lot more challenging for leaders to give real work away, give real responsibility away, give real leadership away. But that's what we see in Nehemiah. Nehemiah gives away real responsibility and true leadership to others, showing that he sees the value that they have. See, and in this church, I never want to be a pastor that says, well, I get to do the real stuff. I get to do the real leadership. I get to decide everything because I'm the leader. That's an unhealthy church. Any church that one man or one woman decides everything is a scary church. Run from that. But in the global church and in this church, I believe as we pursue the mission that God has for us, God calls leaders to delegate leadership away, to give power away. And I want to be the kind of leader that gives responsibility away, because I believe that there are people in this church who have great skills, who have great leadership skills. And so this is what I believe we see in Nehemiah's heart. Nehemiah wants to delegate real responsibility away. But for Nehemiah, there's a problem here. As we continue in the passage, we read this. The city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. For Nehemiah, he recognizes here that though the most important parts of the city were built, there were very few people who currently resided there. And so, yes, the temple had been rebuilt. Yes, the city walls had been rebuilt. But because homes had not been rebuilt, there were very few people actually living there and calling that their home. But for the city to have long-term success, it would take people moving into the city and taking ownership of the city that they lived in. For any city to have long-term success, there needs to be people in the city. There needs to be people playing roles in the city, carrying on the important functions of the city. And so we've talked about this previously. There were many roles that needed to be filled. But now there were few people to fill these roles. But not only were there few people to fill these roles, it would be very difficult for Nehemiah to convince people to come back to Jerusalem. At this point in our story, right, we've seen that there are people there. And these people are on board with building the city walls again. There are people here that have come from all over to help Nehemiah rebuild the city walls. But now that the city walls are rebuilt, it would be very easy for people to go back to where they came from. It would be very easy for people because these people would find it hard to move or willing to move to Jerusalem permanently. Right? They were in Babylon, and now Babylon is Persia, and so they are in Persia, and all they had ever known is this specific place. For many of these people, they set up their entire lives up until this point there. They set up families and businesses and communities in the place where they had come from. And because of this, it would be very hard for them to leave the place where they called home. And yet, I believe that even in the midst of this, Nehemiah recognizes that he would have to entice people to come and live in Jerusalem. So Nehemiah comes up with this plan. We read about this in verse 5. So God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families. And so God puts it on Nehemiah's heart, puts this project on Nehemiah's heart that will allow him to bring the people back to Jerusalem. And we see here that God puts it on Nehemiah's heart that he's to begin assembling nobles, officials, common people to come and register. And so what's going on here is that there were already people living in Jerusalem when Babylon came and took over. And so these people had their land in Jerusalem, but Babylon came into their land in Jerusalem and defeated them and took their land and then brought them to Babylon. And so for a season, they didn't have the land that they owned or were meant to own in Jerusalem. But now Nehemiah has come and restored that city. And because Nehemiah has restored that city, there are people who have claim or who have right to the land that is there. And so Nehemiah begins to see and begins to look at who owns land, who is supposed to own land in Jerusalem. Let me bring them back over. Let me convince them to come back over and take ownership of their land again. Make their home in Jerusalem again. And we read in verse 5, I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. And then we get this long list of families that had returned. And so what Nehemiah has done here is he's found the genealogical record that says which people should own the land in Jerusalem. And as we look at this list, it's important that we recognize that the first time people returned to build the actual temple in Ezra, just like the people Nehemiah was hoping would return during this time, they had been used to life somewhere else. The people that we read about in this list had lived outside of Jerusalem for a long time. but they had to return. They had to decide to return. And as we look at this list, we see the people in this list had to decide where they would put their roots down, where they would call their home. And as we look at this list, we see the decision that they made. We see that the people in this list made the brave decision to leave the town that they had grown comfortable in and head back to Jerusalem. These people who returned the first time saw Jerusalem as their home, decided to put roots down in this land. And yet, as we look at their decision to head back to their land and put roots down there, we see that they also chose to take ownership of the land that they lived in. At the end of Nehemiah 7, we read in verse 70 that some of the heads of the families contributed to the work. We read that the governor gave to the treasury. We read that some of the families gave to the treasury. And we read that the total given by the rest of the people. And so in this, I believe what we see is that these people returning to Jerusalem for the first time realized, if I am going to make this my home, I have to contribute. If I am going to see Jerusalem as my home, it means that I will contribute what I can. As these people returned to Jerusalem, they did not just return to Jerusalem to enjoy the land of Jerusalem and to do nothing about the city that they lived in. But instead, we see that as these people made the brave decision to return, they believed that they were to play a part in what was going on in the city. And we see that this is exactly what they did. We see that each of these people chose to give toward the work that was going on. Why? Because as these people lived in Jerusalem, they came to see Jerusalem as their home. And because it was their home, they realized they were intended to take ownership of it. And in this, I believe we see a reality about the idea of home here. And the reality is this: when one has a home, they have a responsibility toward making sure it's successful. It's the way with our homes, right? When it comes to our homes that we own or that we live in, we have a responsibility toward that space. We have a financial responsibility toward that space. We have to pay rent to that space or pay the mortgage to that space. We have to pay for the maintenance of that space. We have to pay for the furniture that goes in that space. But we also have a physical responsibility toward that space. Because if we live in a home or rent a home, it's our responsibility to make sure that that home stays in shape. It's our responsibility to make sure the chores are done. Because it would be weird, right? If I went over to your house to visit and you said, here's my chore chart, start doing chores with me. I mean, it would be really nice for me to help you with your chores. But it would be weird because that's not my home. But when you have a home, you take ownership of your home. You see your home, you see your space, and you have a responsibility towards it. And yet, I do not believe that it's just with the homes that we live in, but I believe it's also true of the spiritual homes we belong to. As I think about the idea of home, I'm challenged to think of the idea of a home church. As I was thinking about this idea this week, I remembered my first sermon that I ever preached as the senior pastor here. The sermon was titled, Welcome Home. And in it, I challenged us as a congregation to ask ourselves the question, do we believe that this church is our home church? We had been through a difficult season as a church, and I saw a lot of people leaving our church, and yet I knew, like Nehemiah did, if this was going to have long-term success, it would mean people seeing it as their home. Right? Nehemiah sees, if this Jerusalem city is going to have success, people need to put their roots down here. And I believe it's true of the church. If the church has success, it will be because people put their roots down here. And yet I realize that like the people that Nehemiah was trying to convince to come back, there's a lot of people in our current Christian culture that don't want a church home. That are better off without a church home, they think. And so their mindset is, I will just go from church to church to church to church, and I will like a sermon that I hear, but then I'll go to another church and hear that sermon, but then I'll go to another church and hear that sermon, and I'll enjoy the worship of that church, but I don't want to commit to that church. I don't want to commit to a church. And I recognize that it is easier to hop from church to church. And when one church does something that you don't like, to leave that church. That is easier. But I don't believe that was God's intention for church involvement. I don't believe that was ever what God envisioned when God set up the idea of the local church. Instead, I believe that God calls us and says, will you put roots down in a local church and see a local church as your home? And so this is my desire for us at Redeemer. It is my desire that we would see this local church as a church home that we are called to belong to. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir because most of you do see this as your church. But when we see this church as our church home, we come to know that because it is our home, we have a responsibility towards it. Just like Nehemiah's people here, we have a responsibility towards this home. Just like with your home you live in, if you live in a certain home, you have responsibility towards it. And that's true of church homes as well. If you have a church home, you are called to see it as a place that you have ownership of. Financial ownership, physical ownership, serving ownership. And when we have a church home, we have a responsibility where we're invited by God to serve the mission of the church home. Because we believe it is our home. And so if this is our home, we recognize that we are called by God to say, God, how would you use me here? God, I'm putting roots down here, but what do you want to do through my roots here? God, I'm settling in this space, but what do you want me to do as a result? How do you want me to serve? How do you want me to give? How do you want me to live as a result of this being my home? Let us pray. Dear God, I thank you for the gift of the local church, God. God, what a gift you set up when you created the local church. A body that we can commit to, that we can live alongside, that we can go through the joys of life with and celebrate together. But we also go through the pains of life with, and we suffer together, and we pray together when we go through that suffering, God. When we exist in the church, what we're saying is, I don't believe my life is all about me. I don't believe my life is all about getting what I want. But I believe you call me, God, to others, to live life in community with others, to be with others, and to have a responsibility toward the church I call my home. God, and so for those of us who call this church our home, would we see that we have ownership of it? Would we take ownership of it? Would we see where we can give and where we can serve and where we can make this home successful, God? Successful in our mission ultimately of helping people to find and follow you. God, as we see this church as our home, would you strengthen us in us taking ownership of it? Recognizing that it doesn't belong to the pastor, it doesn't belong to the board, it doesn't belong to just one person, but it belongs to all of us collectively seeing the church as our home. because we believe you've called us to put roots down here, God. We thank you.